Okay, so welcome to the OLLI lecture series. We are going to have Beth Lambert joining us for a wonderful presentation. Beth Lambert is Professor Emerita of English at Gettysburg College. She has published and taught courses on subjects as diverse as Jane Austen's novels, life writing through the centuries, and 18th century English politics. Her biography of Edmund Burke of Beaconsfield, was published by the University of Delaware Press. Today, she will be speaking on looking at the American Revolution through British eyes. Beth, you can get started. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Let's see, share screen. And that will take me to, there we go. Share. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And I understand you are baking there as well as we are doing here. So on these days, I'm reminded why so many of the Jamestown colonists died, because they were not accustomed to this heat. So we can certainly empathize with them. Just a quick how I got into the British side of the American Revolution. In 1976, my parents offered to take care of our children if my husband and I wanted to go someplace. So we decided to go to England. And we were there on the 4th of July in 1976. And at Greenwich, there was an exhibit that was the British side of the American Revolution. So through the years in teaching and everything, that buzzed around in the back of my head. And so then when I retired, in 2008, I decided to really get into this and see what it was all about. So, as you can imagine, it is a very, very large subject. And any one of the things that we're going to talk about today could be a presentation all by itself. And so I will pause at different sections and ask if there are any questions or comments. Also, if you want a bibliography, a list of the books that I've used for all of this, I'd be more than happy to send it. So I asked Liz about that, and she said that's a possibility. So just let me know. Okay, to get started on all of this, we will go to, here we go. Okay, these are going to be the bits and pieces. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the relevant bits of English history that feature into us as a colony, a possession of England. The next part, selective colonial history, and primarily the significance of the French and Indian War. Third part, governing the colonies from afar. The fourth part, the crucible 1763 to 1776, in this whole issue of representation. And then finally, we'll get into the war 1776 to 1783. So I think you can see why this is such a large subject. I told my husband at one point I was trying to make a dolphin out of a whale, and I think you can understand that. Okay, this is what we were taught. And I think it was our 4th grade history class, that the Americans were being oppressed by the British colonial system, that the war was started as a result of unprovoked military aggression by the British, that the English generals were incompetent, they wore their red coats, and the colonists had the sense to fight them, from behind trees, that the founding fathers were godlike in their wisdom and foresight, and there were few who remained loyal to the king, but they were definitely a minority. So, why did powerful Britain lose to its upstart colonies? The simple answer is, and the all-important one, is that the French joined the fight on the American side. However, the answer is much more complex than this and goes way back. So we have to start back in England. England governed America for a total of 219 years. And the fact that the English governed rather than the French or the Spanish, because as you know, the French were colonizing to the north, the Spanish to the south, is a significant feature because England is unique in its form of government and its history, obviously. Okay, the kings and queens of America. We tend to think, because the first, the Roanoke, the lost colony of Roanoke, that was founded during the turn of Elizabeth I. So we think of that, and then we jump over to George III when we talk about our history with association to England. There is a lot that went on in between, as you can see. For one thing, from 1649 to 1660, England was not governed by any royalty. It was a commonwealth, and we had Oliver Cromwell. So there's a lot of history in there in between, and it all affected the colonies. So some numbers. We talk about the first historical generation, and the historical generation it's not the same as, a family generation. It's a period of history and what happened during that time. So America, before the Revolution, had two historical generations. The first, almost 380,000 people are thought to have sailed from England to America. Twice as many English as Spanish, 40 times as many came from England as came from France. So that's, a lot. Edmund Burke, one of my very favorite people, wrote that when he was talking about his speech during the conciliation with the colonies, how these problems could be resolved, he said, the colonists are therefore not only devoted to liberty, but to liberty according to English ideas and on English principles. So, what are these English ideas and English principles? There are two fundamental aspects of this. One is the rule of law, and the other is religion. As you know, the Anglican Church is the state religion of England, and the Archbishop of Canterbury crowns the Queen. The religion is very much embedded in English law and in English practice. The fundamental English documents that Burke was referring to were the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, and Acts of Parliament. If you look at this, these are Acts of Parliament that go all the way back to medieval times. And I don't want to get too much into the side of this, but all over England, there are record offices that have these manuscripts that go way back to the Middle Ages and so on. And when you handle them, you find out that, there's a lot of dirt and they seem to fall apart. Anyhow, the Magna Carta, all of these are reflected in the American laws and rights. The English Bill of Rights we'll get to in a little bit and explain what that is. But all of English law, English common law, is our law. We too have common law. I think Louisiana is the only state that does not have the English common law. All right, the two significant historical events when politics and religion mixed was the English Civil War, 1642 to 1660, and the restoration of the monarchy. Both of these events profoundly affected the colonies. The English Civil War, and you've probably seen, images and so on of the Cavaliers and the Puritans. The reason King Charles I was brought to trial and execution is that Cromwell and the military took over Parliament after the king refused to call Parliament for 11 years. Also, the king was married to a French Catholic, and both of those things were a sore point. So they put him on trial for not calling Parliament, for being a traitor to the English Commonwealth, or ideas as it was then. So the monarch monarchy was replaced by the Commonwealth, then the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell. Well, the pendulum always swings in the opposite direction. The English got sick and tired of the Puritan rule, and it was puritanical. By the end of Cromwell's reign, he had put in laws talking about clothes, and he shut down theaters, no card playing, on and on. The term puritanical is very apt. This came about with the restoration of the monarchy when they saw that Cromwell died, his son took over. His son was not Oliver Cromwell. And by that point, the Protectorate was falling apart. They got one of the generals to go to the Charles II, the son, who was sheltering at The Hague, and asked him to come back, which he did in 1660. But then when he died, his brother James took over, and James was a Catholic. So we have this all over again. At this point, James realized that he did not want to lose his head like his father. And so he abdicated and left England. The members of Parliament, they appointed a commission to go to Holland, of all places, because Mary was the daughter of this King Charles I. And I know all these kings are probably driving me crazy, but she was a legitimate, could legitimately inherit the monarchy. She was married to William. They invited them to become joint sovereigns of England, but under certain conditions. And the text, the Declaration of Right that they made them sign, is a series of by and clauses enumerating the ways the king, James II, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion and the laws and liberties of this kingdom. The English Declaration of Rights fits into the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson knew the English Declaration of Rights. You have the same wording. Raising and keeping a standing army in this kingdom in the time of peace. He has kept among us in times of peace armies without the consent of our legislation. For violating the freedom of election of members, assuming and exercising a power. All of these things you can see in our Declaration of Independence. So the English Bill of Rights formalizes the rule by law. And if you put in here the president in place of the monarchy, royal interference with the law is prohibited. The monarch cannot unilaterally establish new courts or act as judge, cannot impose taxes without the consent of Parliament, cannot interfere in the election of members of Parliament. Freedom of speech and debates is guaranteed, and no excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishments can be imposed. So you have here, the same kind of thing we have in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, rule by law. So the two basic principles in the English Constitution, the supremacy of Parliament and the rule of law. The rule of law is simply defined as no one is above the law. So in summary, then, the English immigrants who settled in America brought with them the English language, English law and belief in the rule of law, and English history and culture. All of these things, the if we look at the first colonists, if we look at the first generation, this is what they came with. This is what is the basis of our law. Okay, any questions, Liz, before we go into selective colonial history?
I don't see any questions in the chat, but if somebody has a question and wants to raise their virtual hand or their regular hand, any questions, anyone? Not seeing anything yet.
Okay, let's go on to selective colonial history. As you know, colonial history is a very long subject, and you can go colony by colony. So what I did was to pull out the elements that are significant to all of this. The first colony is the lost colony of Roanoke. It's not Roanoke, Virginia. It is further south than Roanoke, Virginia. And it just simply disappeared. That these colonists and Sir Walter Raleigh had a hand in all of this. The colonists were there, were let off the boat. The ship, when it returned, when another group came in 3 years, there was nothing remaining. And there are still books published on somebody has found the solution or, to the problem of what happened to Roanoke. The real settlement occurred in 1606 when John Smith and George Popham went to Maine and called it the colony of Northern Virginia. So if you had lived then, you would be part of the colony of Northern Virginia. The map at this time has Virginia extending from the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. It's just one big swath of pink. And with the end of the American Revolution, they sort of adjusted all of these boundaries. 1607, of course, was Jamestown Landing. And then there in 1620, the Plymouth colony was settled. And this is the old Plymouth Rock. And this was a group that came, the Puritans, a group of them in England went to The Hague and settled there and became unhappy because their children were not practicing their religion or their way of life. They were going native, as it were. So they packed up and came over. 10 years later, the Massachusetts Bay colony was settled, and eventually these two combined. So you have this, we usually kind of lump them all together, but there were two different settlements there. Okay, this is a big leap into history with a lot that went in between, but geography comes into play with the 7 Years' War. We call it the French and Indian War. And I suppose all of you know that George Washington started the whole thing, as it were, that he was part of, he signed, well, a long story is that he and an Indian went to visit the French ambassador. There was a discussion over Fort Necessity. The Native American tomahawked the French ambassador. It is said Washington, not knowing what he was signing, signed a confession. And so at this point, the war broke out between the English and the French here. The truth is that the English and the French had been fighting since 1733. So it's an ongoing war. At the end of the war, and this is what is important, it ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which Britain received Canada from France. Now that is the biggest piece of land that the British received. And at first, they were going to say no thanks to the French they were going to take Jamaica instead. And there was a real discussion in Parliament about, do we want Canada or do we want Jamaica? So the Canadian faction won, with the single exception that off Canada, there is an island that they conceded that the French could have access to for fishing rights. Now, this was a bad mistake in terms of the American Revolution, as we will see. The English also, all French North American claims east of the Mississippi. In the West Indies, they ceded recently taken Guadeloupe and Martinique to France. They got Florida from Spain. West Florida becomes a colony that we rarely hear about. We usually don't think of Florida among the 13 originals. In addition, they received extensive rights in India from France, African Senegal from France, Minorca from France and Spain, Grenada and the Grenadines from France. They ceded recently taken Cuba and the Philippines to Spain. But this is the effect of all of this. In 1753, these were the British possessions in North America. 1763, you can see what has happened. Up there in Canada, down into the islands, in effect, their land holdings were massive 10 years later. At the end of the war, and this is really interesting, there were three competing perspectives about this settlement. The Native Americans had a very interesting one. The British conclusively established their claim to the North American continent. That was what they thought they had done. The Native Americans who fought on the British side believed they had won from the British recognition of the rights to control the interior of North America, on the other side of the Appalachians. The American colonists believed they had secured their western frontier and the right to colonize it. Now, the American colonists believing this, all of this incited the Native Americans said, all right, we are throwing out the colonists, and a series of Indian wars began in which there was a significant number of settlers killed. 2,000 settlers were killed during this time. 4,000 fled to cities rather than being near Indian territory. 400 British soldiers were killed, and also 2,000 warriors were killed. So you have these Indian wars that generated them. The British government, in order to proclaim peace, put in what they call the Proclamation Line. And that was down the Appalachians. And they forbade colonization west of this Proclamation Line for the immediate future, because they wanted the Native Americans to take their land and settle it there. And the settlers were to stay on the eastern side of the Appalachians. This was not going to be a permanent thing, but it was instituted as a way of making peace initially. Well, you can imagine the settlers being told that they had to stay, to the east and not go to the west. George Washington had an agent on the other side of the Appalachians, and he told him to go ahead and continue to buy up land because the England was going to give up on this little idea sooner or later. So you had three different ideas about what happened at the end of that war. In 1763, when that ended, the American colonies were anything but united. Massachusetts, for one example, they were troublemakers from the start. You go all the way back to Plymouth, to the Mayflower. They forbade people of other religions settling in Massachusetts. They established Puritan rule, and they were in favor of Cromwell's rule, with one problem. During his rule, Cromwell looked over to the west and instituted what he called his Western design. He wanted the Spanish out of the Caribbean. And he, by way of seeing that that was done, he wanted the American settlers to pick up and settle Jamaica. He also wanted them to join the army in fighting the Spanish. The colonists, of course, are trying to backtrack on this because they did not want to be involved when in this war, the English Civil War, because in those days you never knew which side you would end up on and where you should, place your bets, as it were. They pleaded distance, and the news and orders and so on got to them a little bit later. In Virginia, you have a completely different situation, because the governor of Virginia at that time, Governor Barclay, he recruited royalists. He recruited Cromwell's enemies to settle in Virginia. He offered them status and land. And nearly all of Virginia's ruling families were founded at this time, because who came here? We had some of these names are going to be familiar. The Washington family came at this time, the Lee family, the Randolph family, and the Fairfax families. All of these are still here, but they all go back to this period in American history and British history. So you've got two completely different cultures. You've got the Puritans up there in Massachusetts, and you've got the Royalists down in Virginia. So, already we're seeing a split. So the second historical generation, this is 1763 to 1776. And again, we have a large proportion coming from the British Isles. 55,000 Protestant Irish, 40,000 Scots, 30,000 English. So a total of 125,000 from the British Isles. Also, 12,000 from German states and Switzerland entered the port of Philadelphia. Now, they could become let's begin with what they couldn't do. They could not own property, and they could not vote for local legislators. They had to establish themselves as British subjects. And to do that, they had to be in residency 7 years. They had to swear allegiance to the King of England. They had to take communion in a Protestant church, and there was a 2 shilling fee to become, a recognized member of the colonies, and partake of land and voting and so on. 84,500 enslaved Africans were imported to the mainland colonies. This, of course, is a whole subject of its own. We've just, been talking about the when it all started. That it's started 1619 when the first slaves came to this country. Theirs is a whole story. And then between 1718 and 1775, 49,000 felons from England and Ireland were transported to the colonies. So what you have by the time of the American Revolution is a very different culture and group than the group that came initially. And that, of course, plays into the American Revolution. So, any questions?
I don't see any in the chat.
Yeah, wait.
Oh. that
How do you
Irma?
raise your hand? Yeah, all right. I'd
That's fine.
like
Go
to
ahead.
know, thank you. If George Washington wanted to buy land west of the Appalachians at the time, did that land belong to the Indians? From whom was he going to purchase that land?
See, that was the interesting thing. Britain thought they owned the land, and the Indians said, how can they own what they don't possess? That was their theory on this, that they owned the land. So what Washington was doing, that already there were a significant number of land agents who had already established themselves in the Ohio country and so on. And that's where Washington wanted to, buy this land. So what he was, it was like a real estate agent that the people had gone over. They said, we possess this land. That's what the Americans believed. And they set up, parcels of land to sell those who were already there. Washington sent his agent to buy some of this.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's there. This is, one of the reasons why everything was so confusing at this point. Okay, governing the colonies from afar. How was it done? Because at the heart of it all, domestic and foreign policy took precedence over colonial affairs. That England, you could say they took America for granted. It had been there, it was part of the system, and they had, remember, the empire by this time, after the French and Indian War, that was extensive. It was India, it was, in the Caribbean. And so they just didn't pay that much attention to what was going on over here. Benign neglect. There was a ramshackle structure of diverse constitutional arrangements among the colonies. Every colony, as I gave you two examples, Massachusetts and Virginia. And what was one law in one colony was another law in another. For example, if you went from Massachusetts and settled in Pennsylvania, you had been married in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania didn't recognize that marriage, and so you had to remarry. So all these laws were different, and it really was this ramshackle arrangement with every colony. I mean, you've got Rhode Island with another set of rules and regulations, to say nothing about eventually Georgia, where you've got all these felons. So every, colony was very different. And the British didn't pay that much attention. They didn't supervise the colonies enough. So this is the way the colonies were managed in London in two ways: the Board of Trade, and then there were colonial agents. The Board of Trade was a function of the King's Privy Council, which were his advisors. And this was what they did. They examined colonial legislation to make sure that they didn't conflict with imperial trade policies. They nominated colonial governors and wrote instructions for governors. They recommended laws to Parliament that affected the colonies. And then they reported on colonial complaints. So this was the official board. On the other hand, there were colonial agents. For example, Edmund Burke was colonial agent for New York. Interestingly enough, Benjamin Franklin, who had been in England for 15 years, was colonial agent for Pennsylvania, as well as Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. So Franklin really had his hand in all five. They represented an individual colony in London. They were selected by the colonial government, and they provided British officials with documentation regarding that colony's interests. So was there a representation in Parliament? No. There were this Board of Trade and the colonial agents. So you had these two groups already working, but as you can see, they didn't necessarily join together. They didn't necessarily weren't talking about the same thing. So then the colonies themselves and how they were governed was interesting. They were an extension of the English government. The governor represented the king. The governor was appointed by Parliament. So, you have this, who was the governor going to be loyal to? He was, say, governor of Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the local Massachusetts Assembly was putting pressure on him to do certain things. The government in London was putting pressure on him to do other things. So he was torn. They said the average tenure of a colonial governor was 5 years because of this, all these conflicting elements. The governor's council was, again, appointed from London. They were subject to approval by the London government, and they function as the Supreme Court for the colony. You probably know that in England, they do not have, this, as we do, this Supreme Court. The House of Lords functions as the Supreme Court in England. Then colonial assemblies went by various names. Members were elected annually by propertied male citizens of the town in a single annual session. So notice this is important because it figures predominantly in this fight as the colonists talked about for representation. The people who could, they were elected only by property male citizens. The colonial assemblies in every town, they were elected by citizens of the town and the counties. What this group did, they made laws, they raised local taxes, and they supported their own militia. So every county, every state had this jumble of, unique circumstances, individually governing locally and without any recourse really to the larger governor at the top, which would be the colonial government. Okay, on the subject of representation, no taxation without representation. This was one of the keys that the complaints of the colonists. In England, representation was consisted in the British Parliament, two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords, as you know, is hereditary, and the House of Commons are the individuals elected. The interesting thing about the members of the House of Commons, they did not have to reside in the area, city, town that they represented. They could live anywhere in England and be elected for a certain district. And thus you had Edmund Burke living in London, and he had his country house in Beaconsfield. He represented Bristol at one point, and that's a whole different story. If you know Bristol, Bristol was one of the biggest slave trading cities that the ships came in from Africa, and then they went to England, but there was a lot of slavery going on in Bristol, and Burke lost Bristol because he didn't bother to go and campaign for himself. Anyhow, at the time of the American Revolution, William Pitt was the prime minister. And in order to be a member of the House of Commons, members had to own property, although this was not always followed, but it usually was. They had to be Anglican and take an oath to that effect. This did not apply to the Scots Presbyterians, and they were not paid. They were volunteers for a very long, arduous job. Who could vote for members of the House of Commons? It varied from virtually all adult male homeowners to a handful of landowners. No women could not vote, and so on. The types of these voters, anyone who owned a hearth, and then freemen. The property qualifications varied and were subject to approval from the House of Commons. So again, who are the voters? White males, and that was it. This, I could not resist adding this. The women were part of the campaigning because the members of the House of Parliament had to campaign. And a contemporary described fighting mobs through whose greasy ranks the brilliant Whig ladies, headed by the Duchess of Devonshire and Mrs. Crewe, moved like beings of another sphere. The Duchess of Devonshire, particularly active, campaigned by driving voters to the polls in her carriage. She earned the title of the Kissing Duchess. Now, every time I read this, I think this is, we talk about, buses taking voters and all of this. It went on then. It went on in the 18th century. And then Jane Burke's role was even more interesting. And someone who was with them for a period of time noted that Burke is very careless of his papers, would drop on the floor a paper, though it contained treason, as he would do a newspaper cover. Mrs. Burke watches over everything, collects his scraps, arranges and documents every paper. As you can imagine, Jane Burke is a whole subject by herself and a wonderful one. And here we have a contemporary cartoon of the Kissing Duchess. And this is the Duchess of Devonshire. And this is somebody from the greasy mob. Oh, okay, we are into part 4. Questions?
No questions in the chat.
Wow. I'm getting away with murder here.
I don't know if anybody wants to raise their hand. Any questions, anyone? I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. All right. We're really getting into it at this point when things begin to heat up. Britain's situation after the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. And you probably have heard this, that they were deeply in debt. You can imagine the 7 Years' War had really been a world war. The peacetime budget of England was £8 million. The interest on the debt was 4.5 million %. In order to reduce the debt, Parliament decided to regulate trade so that profits would flow into English coffers. That meant enforcing trade laws and ending colonial smuggling. One way to make sure the tariff was collected was to send customs officials to the colonies. So this is a significant cause of irritating the colonists. As we said earlier, it had been a system of benign neglect. No one was paying too much attention to what was going on. After this war, England decided they had to do something about getting some money. Okay, and this comes from this book that I picked up in 1976, The British Story of the American Revolution. The Stamp Act made good sense and seemed legitimate. Very few people in Britain, and indeed very few in North America, envisaged the wave of protest that would follow the Stamp Act. Benjamin Franklin even recommended a friend for the job of stamp distributor. The opposition, unexpected and all but spontaneous, caught Britain unawares. So they did not expect the row that was going to happen. In 1766, Parliament declared that they had the right and power to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies and people of America to the crown of Great Britain in all cases whatsoever. This is all tied in with the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, all the rest of it. And we'll see that the majority of these things were repealed. However, Parliament had come forth and said, we have the right to govern you and to make laws, and you need to obey them. In terms of taxation, in 1763, the average Briton paid 26 shillings per year in taxes. The equivalent figure for a Massachusetts taxpayer was 1 shilling. Britons paid 5.4 times as much as taxpayers in Massachusetts, 18 more times than Connecticut, 6.3 times more than New Yorkers, 15.5 times more than Virginians, and 35.8 times more than Pennsylvanians paid in taxes. So you can see that the English had very little sympathy when the Americans said that they did not want to be taxed. The further complication was that every colony had distinct currency, but they adhered to the pound, shilling, and pence denominations. There also in circulation at the time were Spanish pieces of 8 that, they were coins that could be broken. You take a little piece and, to pay for one thing and you still have the rest of the coin. In addition, money from England circulated as well as that from other colonies. And one of the, if you have studied the Continental Congress and the real difficulty that the Americans had initially in terms of money and being poor and so on. I mean, you have John Adams, bitterly complaining that he was supposed to be an ambassador and he had absolutely no way of earning money and was not paid. George Washington served as a volunteer in the army and did not get paid. Okay, the question always comes up. How much was the pound in 1776 equal to our dollar in, say, 2020? 1 pound in 1776 is equal in purchasing power to about, say, roughly 160 pounds in 2018. This means that prices in 2018 are 159.99 times higher than average prices, according to the Office for National Statistics. And as you can see, and I plead, I am not a mathematician. This is, I went to the Office of National Statistics, pulled this stuff off. 40 pounds in 1776 equals today 6,000 pounds. Now, the conversion rate today is, when I looked it up a couple days ago, is $1.40 for 1 pound. And then, as I said, I'll let you take it from here. Keep in mind that for a colonist to come to America, an English colonist, it cost 40 pounds. So you did not have a lot of poor people coming. They had to pay their way. And they sold, many of them just sold all of their household goods, took the money and paid their passage over, knowing and believing that they could do very well here rather than in England or elsewhere. So it did cost. The exception, of course, were indentured servants. They came for a period of 7 years. Either someone in England paid for their passage, or someone here in America, a craftsman, a farmer, a plantation owner who wanted help would pay for indentured servants. They came to America, they worked free for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, their indenture was up. They were given 50 acres of land and so on. So the affording to come here is a subject of itself. All right, all of these different acts, in order to bring money to the English coffers, one of them, 1764, was the Sugar Act. And what that did, it halved the tax on molasses that had been unenforced, and it listed goods that could only be exported to Britain. Well, big fuss here about that, and it was repealed. In 1765, and this is the one we hear the most about, was the Stamp Act. That was a tax on legal documents, papers, magazines, and newspapers, and it was repealed, although it still is a standard tax in England. And, we pay tons of taxes, as you know, on, trying to get your car licensed and, all the rest of it. We're paying taxes all the time. Townshend duties on American imports. The resistance to this one brought British troops to Boston and resulted in the Boston Massacre. This was the big one then, and it was repealed. So all of the, when they list, well, they gave us the Stamp Act, they gave us the Molasses Act, and so on. These were repealed. There was one that was not, which we'll get to in a minute. Elizabeth Montagu was, I don't know if you've ever heard the term blue stocking, that she was sort of the head of a group of intellectual women in London at the time. They were called blue stockings because they would hold these parties, you could call them, and invite members of parliament. There was a mixture of people who were writers, they were members of parliament. There was Gilbert Stuart, who was the I'm thinking of the naturalist, You had Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. These assemblies, these blue stocking assemblies, and the way they got the name is that somebody was visiting from France and had blue woolen stockings on, in, you know, rather than the black or the white, as was custom at the time. And somebody said, could he come to one of these blue stocking or these meetings? And Elizabeth Montagu said, yes, and you may even wear your blue stockings. So anyhow, she writing to another woman at the time, there is a cruel tax going to be laid on cottagers who are to pay the tax if they have 7 windows. So these poor wretches must live without light and air. All this to please America. To please North America, the duty is to be taken off molasses and a heavier duty to be laying on wheels. I wish our ministers were shipped off to their friends in America. There was a lot of reaction, as you can imagine, in England this time, at this, to, you know, American behavior at this time, and that too is a whole other subject. So in 1770, Parliament takes off all duties except on tea. And here we go. The problem was that it lay with the East India Company, which had been founded in 1600. That the East India Company had been given monopoly on all trade from Asia. And it became a governing body in England. It started out as a trading company, and through the years, to eliminate, and this is 1721, foreign competition, an act was passed that required colonists to import their tea only from Britain. The company sold its tea wholesale to at auctions in England. British firms bought the tea, exported it to the colonies, where they resold it to merchants in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston. So this is, you know, a 3-way deal here. The company's problem in 1772, that it was cash strapped. It had enormous debts, and the banking crisis in England made it impossible to borrow more, and it faced demands from its creditors. By the end of August, 20 ships lay moored at the London docks, and between them they had 90,000 chests of tea. In addition, there was unsold tea from the season before. So you can see that, you know, England felt as though it had to get rid of this tea. So the solution was to export tea directly to the colonies and eliminate the middleman. No longer did these ships have to, you know, sell their tea to somebody in Britain who would resell it and so on. And they did so that with lowering the price of tea. It was exceptionally low. They didn't jack up the price when they sent it over to the colonies. So that brings us to another subject, and that is colonial provocation of various sorts. So the colonists are not innocent and everything that came after. The Boston Massacre is one example. All right. Who called fire? That was the mystery that is still ongoing. And the Boston Massacre is a book that just came out this past year. And she has done extensive research into, I mean, it's just, you know, a book on the Boston Massacre. And what she has found in going through all the testimony and everything else around this, was it a warning, a command, a taunt? No one knew then, and no one knows now. And you probably know that it was John Adams who defended the British soldiers who were accused of firing on the colonists, and they did. 3 died on the spot. All right, smuggling is another provocation. John Hancock was the king of the smuggling trade. He had more money by smuggling than any other way. They smuggled molasses, rum, tea, and silver. Hancock's ship Liberty was impounded in 1768. He smuggled glass, lead, paper, molasses, and tea. The British spies in Europe reported unusually large shipments from Holland and Sweden heading for America. And Hancock smuggled his during the French and Indian War, and traded with them. So let's see. Yeah, we missed a few here. Okay, yeah. Another incident was the ship Gaspé was a customs ship, was attacked, boarded, and looted and torched by a group of colonials in Rhode Island. This was an act of felony. Now notice 1772. This was years before the revolution was officially started. So we've got, the Boston Massacre, the ongoing Hancock smuggling trade, and the Gaspé incident. The reaction in England to this last one was that the Admiralty turned to the Royal Commission of Inquiry, and they were unable to find sufficient evidence and declared their inability to deal with the case. So from the British perspective, the Gaspé raid was the first step along the road to war, and it poisoned the official mind in England. So you already have, feelings against anti-colonial feelings. And then we had this spontaneous demonstration in Boston. A group of colonists dressed up like Native Americans. They dumped 342 chests of tea, 92,000 pounds of it into Boston Harbor. 10,000 pounds worth of tea was destroyed. And Boston was not the only place where tea was dumped into the harbor. So, to continue colonial provocation, again, 1774, British spies in Holland reported a colonial ship, the Smack, loading arms, gunpowder, and cannon to go to Rhode Island. The British government tried to get the Dutch to intervene, and they would not. So before declaring armed reaction, the government had to consult with lawyers who pleaded they had to wait for the weather in Atlantic to change before they could freely, really examine all of this or, resolve all of this. And so all of this too just disappeared sort of into the sunset. And so because of the Boston Tea Party, as you probably know, Boston was punished by the Intolerable Acts. Now, this is another thing where you're going to read all kinds of versions. If you read colonial documents at this time, it sounds as though the people of Boston were absolutely starving because the port was closed. Then the Massachusetts Government Act, all offices of the government were under control of the British government. The Administration of Justice Act, all trials accusing royal officials were to take place in Britain or another colony. So that if a crime was committed and a British soldier, official was accused, they were could not be tried in Boston. They had to be taken elsewhere in the United States, in America, or overseas. And of course, given the temperament of the Bostonians, this really set them off. The port was closed, but they received supplies, food, and so on overland. The military, General Gage, replaced Thomas Hutchinson as governor of Massachusetts. So you have the governor or the government becoming military. Pouring salt on the wound. In 1774, as they closed Boston's ports and so on, Parliament effected the Quebec Act. This gave freedom of religion to Catholics. It restored French forms of civil law that were in accordance with English common law, and they enlarged the boundaries of Canada. Now you see where they enlarged them too. They took them, brought them down into, passed through the Great Lakes. If it is later said, if they had done this earlier to the colonies, the American colonies, there may not have been the total disruption that brought about the American Revolution. Because notice is particularly this second one, they restored French forms of civil law that were in accordance with English common law, that if they had allowed the colonial legislatures to govern more the way they wished, there would not have been, and they had not imposed so many, so many laws and so on from Britain. So what happened was the proclamation of rebellion was issued by the king. Many of our subjects in diverse parts of our colonies and plantations in North America, misled by dangerous men, and then the proclamation by the king strictly charged all our officers, as well civil as well as military, to use their utmost to suppress rebellion. So at this point, they considered the colonists in rebellion. What was the reaction in England? Samuel Adams said, if taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representative, are we not reduced in the character of free subjects to the miserable state of slaves? Samuel Johnson had his own view of the thing, and he was asked by the government. He was Johnson was a writer. He was as some of you may know, he wrote the first dictionary in the English language. He is the subject of Boswell's Life of Johnson, and he founded the Literary Club, so he was a predominant literary figure. If slavery is thus fatally contagious, how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Now, this was Johnson's response, and this was behind, this situation was behind Johnson's remark. By 1772, slavery in England was effectively eliminated. There was the Mansfield Declaration, and it was a there is a film, if you want to see it in film. The title of the film is Belle. A slave, fearing he'd be sent back to the Caribbean, ran away from his English master. And the master wanted to have a law that said he could take the slave anywhere he wanted. The abolitionist movement at this point was very strong in England, and they brought the case to court. And the decision was, no master ever was allowed here to take a slave by force to be sold abroad because he had deserted from his service or for any other reason whatsoever. We cannot say the cause set forth by this return is allowed or approved of by the laws of this kingdom. Therefore, the man must be discharged. This Mansfield effectively eliminated slavery in England. So you've got an abolitionist sense already in England, and they did, and this again is this whole subject for a whole other presentation, is the English view of all of this. And they called the colonists in England were called the slave owners. And it was presumed that that's where the Americans were. This was the first in 3 English acts. 1807 was the abolition of the slave trade, and the abolition of slavery, period, in any possession of England was effected in 1833. So they were well before us. Okay. 1776, the Declaration of Independence. The British said, so what? They refused to recognize it under a theory of perpetual allegiance, that you were perpetually belong to, as it were, the country in which you were born. Once a subject, always a subject. The immigrant subjects return their duty of allegiance to the government erected in the original colony, and Great Britain denied the right of colonists. They challenged the legitimacy of the revolutionary government, and this affected the war in 1812. If you remember, that all started with the British impressment of sailors on American ships, because the British said that if you were born before the Peace of Paris in 1783, you were a British subject, and if you were an American, you could be captured because you were a traitor. So that's, this whole thing figured very predominantly into the War of 1812. So it never ends. Okay, what about the Americans who were in London on July 4th, 1776? They were under surveillance, but they weren't prosecuted if they didn't break any laws. There were those who stayed rather than return, hoping to bring about a reconciliation. There were a lot of law students at the time. Edmund Burke was at Middle Temple Law School with William Franklin, Benjamin's son. Burke exchanged letters with Benjamin Franklin on the subject of independence and so on. Some had divided loyalties. They weren't too sure that this revolution was a good thing. And some families, interestingly, kept one family member in England to protect their estates. Let's see who, one of these, let's see who wins. We have somebody in both camps. All right, this is probably one of the most important factors that affected the American Revolution. And that was the sailing times from England and to England. Remember, ships were the only way to get between the two countries. And again, Burke said, seas roll and months pass between the order and the execution, and the want of a speedy explanation of a single point is enough to defeat a whole system. If you can imagine needing an answer to a question about a point of law, a dispute that needs to be settled, and you had to wait for 4 weeks, 7 weeks until you get this, it just confuses everything. All of the people talking about the revolution at the time cited this distance, the 3,000 miles. And you can see the sailing times from England and to England weeks. And you didn't start at any time of the year. The only exception were ships going to the West Indies. And the prevailing winds and currents, the fastest sailing route passed around the north of Ireland, and ships traveling. Now this, you think of, you've got the British Army, they need supplies. They can't get them in the middle of winter. Ships traveling to the colonies sailed midsummer to late September. And initially, ships could be lost quite frequently. By the end of the 17th century, standard practice was to travel in convoys. So these sailing times and so on were a big factor in the in fighting the war. Okay, Liz, that was a lot.
Okay, we do have a few questions in here.
All right.
Let's see, the first one. During the decade before the revolution, could you please comment as to the roles, activities of some of our forefathers, such as Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Hamilton, etc.? Did they have any real power?
Yeah, actually, if I could rephrase that, I didn't like that question. The powers in England, did they view Washington as an enemy or a potential enemy? Did they view Jefferson? I know Jefferson, as I recall, was a magistrate. Washington ran his plantation at Mount Vernon. Were they viewed as potential adversaries to England? I was just curious how they viewed them.
No, they were not. And for example, you have John Adams defending the British soldiers, at the massacre. Also, Washington was a member of the British Army at the time of the French and Indian War, and he fought with them. So the ones that the local British kept an eye on was Sam Adams, if anybody, because he was stirring up trouble from the start, as was Paul Revere. So initially they were not looked askance, but as things began to heat up, in particular when Washington then took over the troops and so on, then they were looked upon as the enemies. And if they had been captured during the American Revolution, if we lost that war, they would have been hanged as traitors. One film that brings that out, if you've ever seen Benedict Arnold, that's an excellent film, and that's brought out there.
Thank you.
Another one?
Not another question, but a comment. Brilliant lecture. Professor Lambert has indeed turned a whale into a dolphin.
Yes. Thank you. That is so true.
I don't see any other hands up, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
20 after 4, so we're going to have to zip through this. The British troops in the colonies before the French and Indian War, and I will sort of not go through blow by blow here. The British troops were few. More and more were brought in because the colonists refused to fight during the French and Indian War. They left it up to the British, and the British bitterly complained about their troops. Also, they had to cover an area from Canada to Florida, and they didn't have enough troops to hold any ground taken in battle. So the troop numbers were against them. Then this Quartering Act that everybody talks about, the Quartering Act said that if they did not have rooms in a fort, if they could not be, housed there, they were to use inns, livery stables, ale houses, and so on, if needed. And when they had to be housed in, private housing, colonists were paid for housing the troops. They were not just shoved in the front door and said, you know, catch as catch can here. Boston was a case in point. They had 2 regiments. So before Lexington and Concord, the militiamen had been building up arms and ammunitions. And so 4 months before Lexington and Concord, a bunch of colonists attacked a fort, that Fort William and Mary at the entrance to Portsmouth Harbor. The British flag was taken down and Americans Lexington and Concord, how to provoke the British into shooting. Who fired the first shot? Lexington, no one knows. Concord, the British definitely did. These patriots at this point were lawbreakers because the munitions deposits were not theirs. And already in place was a system of express riders, signals, you know, by land to if I see kind of thing. We jumped ahead again. A side note to all of this, that General Gage's wife was accused of betraying his plans to Samuel Adams and Joseph Warren. They kind of figured, or Gage kind of figured out his wife had something to do with this. She was an American. So the deck shipped back to England. Mrs. Gage was on it. Okay, the main reasons were we've talked about this. News traveled slowly. At first, the British government thought it was a police action. And that's, you know, you find that in letters. And then command and control elements were being micromanaged from London. And then you got French and Spain entering the war. Okay, who were the micromanagers? 3. Lord Germain, he was the one who sent battle plans to such as Burgoyne and Cornwallis. And of course, in London, he doesn't know the territory. He didn't know the distances between colonies. They, you know, so if you're going to micromanage something from afar where you've never been, figure it out. Poor Lord North, he wanted to get out of the whole thing. The king would not let him. He was prime minister at the time. And then the king, you know, why didn't he just give in? Because no 18th century ruler would just give in to a bunch of rebel colonists. Oh, okay, where things went awry. Logistical nightmare we've talked about. They just, you know, the distance, and then at this point, supplies had to come up through Canada and down into the colonies where the fighting was going on. The first plan was to blockade the American coasts. The Howe brothers wanted, at the same time that they were supposed to be engaged in, you know, restraining the colonists, they wanted to make peace with them. This did not work. Burgoyne was the most famous. Burgoyne and Cornwallis. Burgoyne lost Saratoga because of Germain, that he was finalizing plans for Burgoyne's offensive to come from Canada to Albany, and he didn't realize that Howe and Burgoyne would be far apart. Battle of Saratoga, Burgoyne's defeated. But Burgoyne was not going to sit by and let this happen. He gave his Treaty of Convention. The British were not to be taken prisoners of war, but they were to lay down their arms. Canadians were to be sent back. Washington said, "Are you crazy? You send all these soldiers back and they're going to turn around and come back on the next ship." And so what did they do with these 4,000 prisoners from Saratoga? They marched them down to Charlottesville, Virginia. And if you ever go to Charlottesville, you will probably come in on Barracks Road, given that name, because this is where the soldiers, the British soldiers, were marched to after the Battle of Saratoga. Okay, then France and Spain get into this. France comes, they've been waiting, of course, since 1763. Spain gets into it because they want to fight in Florida. There they did not succeed. By 1780, the Netherlands had joined France and Spain. That America became the secondary sphere of operation. Home defenses were the first priority. And this is what happened, that the commanding general in America in 1774, or no, not 1774, during the war, as soon as France entered, he was to send 5,000 of his men to the West Indies, 20 ships of the line back to home waters, 13 more ships to the West Indies. So you already have, you know, the troops leaving, and the poor guys who were left. Clinton and Cornwallis, you know, were wrapping it up at the end. The thing most of us don't realize is that Yorktown was a siege. It was not a battle. Cornwallis had 7,000 British, German, and Loyalist troops against 18,000 French and American troops. The battle ended after 3 weeks of nonstop bombardment. So this was not a quick and easy win by any, and the British were vastly outnumbered. The Peace of Paris, I don't know if you've seen this, if you've been to Winterthur in Delaware, they have this original painting. You've got the Franklin and you know, the John Jay, the rest of them. The British were not going to sit for such a portrait. And so you have on the right-hand side of this portrait a blank, because they refused to pose. The Peace of Paris gave formal recognition to the United States, opened up the Mississippi River to citizens of all nations, provided for the evacuation of British forces, and in the Peace of Paris, the United States was to provide for the restitution of all estates and properties belonging to loyalists. Okay, what became of the generals? Burgoyne became a member of the House of Commons. He was also in charge of the army in Ireland, and he was a successful playwright. When all of them went marching down to Virginia, Burgoyne and Jefferson had dinner, and Burgoyne, you know, composed these plays for the distraction of these poor prisoners. Cornwallis became Governor General of India and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Cornwallis is buried in India and a magnificent tomb. Howe remained active and successful in the army, and Clinton defended his command. He became the House of Parliament. And these last two subjects, two sidebars that are important subjects by themselves, as I said, it helped that when America won the war, it actually helped the cause of the abolitionists in England, because they said if America had become part of the British government with the slave-holding South, they do not think that the abolitionist cause in England would have been as successful as it was. And the other one, of course, is the Revolutionary War loyalists. I give a whole course on that. So, you know, as I said, it's a whole big subject. Okay, and this is the end. The Second British Empire. No one in 1783 foresaw that the breakup of the First British Empire would be followed by Britain's creating in the 19th century a grander and even more powerful Second British Empire. So Britain became the world's first superpower and first industrialized nation. So anyhow, as we are about to celebrate the 4th of July, I hope this has kind of given you information you didn't have before and sort of a new view of it all. So Liz, where are we?
I don't see any questions. Does anybody want to, oh, here we have Terry McCoy. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Okay, yes, here I
There you
am. Hi, Beth, how are you?
Hi, Terry. How are you?
Good, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Well, she's the first one who started it.
Well, actually, it was Barbara, we know that.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you so much for offering this for us.
You're welcome. You're
See you.
welcome. And also, if anybody has any questions or reactions afterward, you can always email them to me and I will be more than happy to answer.
Beth, why don't you give me your email and I'll put it in the chat?
Okay, probably elambert@gettysburg.edu.
Lambert at Gettysburg.
Yeah, GETTYSBURG.edu.
Lambert at Gettysburg.edu.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Yeah,
Okay.
so I put it in the chat. Any other questions? Anybody? You can raise your hand or any questions at all? Wow. This is surprising.
Yeah, I know. I thought I'd have tons of them. They'll probably all come after.
Yeah.
But everybody's had time to absorb it all.
Yeah, I don't see anybody raising their hand. You can raise your regular hand or virtual hand. Well, this was great. That's good. I think you covered it all then, Beth. You can
I
give your
hope I'm
test.
just-
You can give the test now. Do the exam.
Yeah, yeah.
Beth, this was wonderful, really. Thank you so much.
Well,
Really.
thank you.